Hello, everybody. Hi, it's now 1 o'clock. Welcome to this session J on measuring inequality. My name is Joel Suss. I'm giving the third of 3 presentations. Very delighted to be here alongside Brian Nolan and Victor Bustos. Just a few notes before we begin. All presenters will have 20 minutes to present their work and then 10 minutes for Q&A. Please, if you have a question, use the Q&A facility. And then once you're invited to ask a question, we'll unmute you and you'll be able to ask it. Please state your name and affiliation when you do so. And just a note that this session will be recorded. And also there is a breakout session following this, so we can continue the conversation over there. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our first presenter, Professor Brian Nolan. Please take it away, Brian.
Thanks, Joel. So I'm being told I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Can you share your screen, at least?
Let me try.
Oh, okay. That seems to, yeah, I see your screen.
That working now?
That is working, yeah.
Super. Well, I'll press ahead and I'll watch the clock, but if you give me a shout in 20 minutes, that'll make sure I stop.
Yeah, I'll give you a shout with 5 minutes left also. Just
thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Joel, and for doing the chairing. And thanks for those attending. So this is co-authored work with my colleague from Oxford, Juan Palomino, who's in the session, and with Philippe van Kerm from Luxembourg and Salvatore Norelli from Rome and New York. What we've been doing in this work is trying to exploit the main source of information about wealth in the UK, which is the Wealth and Asset Survey, to do comparative analysis of intergenerational transmission of wealth and its impact on the distribution of wealth. And this faces us with a number of challenges in using that data source that I'll explain, because I think it's important to understand why this has been such a barrier. And in trying to do this comparative analysis, it was one of the major tasks we had to undertake. So the object of the exercise is, okay, thanks. The object of the exercise is to assess the nature and patterns of intergenerational transmission, which takes place via inheritance and gifts during the lifetime of the donor in Britain compared with other rich countries, because we think this comparative perspective potentially offers some very important insights into the what drives these patterns, including the role of policies, in particular with respect to taxation. And wealth inequality, of course, alongside income inequality, has received an enormous amount of attention in recent years, but it's surprising in that light that we struggle to do something rather basic, such as put patterns in rich countries alongside each other in a consistent way and see how much those distributional patterns, and in particular the role of intergenerational transmission, how little handle we have on that empirically in a comparative framework. We have some very good studies for individual countries, but we don't have such a good comparative picture. So what we're doing is we're exploiting the main and mostly high quality household wealth surveys. So the long-standing and sort of the benchmark study in this context is the US Survey of Consumer Finances, going since 1983, and happily, in terms of trying to capture the top, which of course is one of the main challenges, being able to exploit data from the tax system to oversample towards the top. And we'll say a little bit more about that as we go. The other very important resource over the last decade is the Eurozone Household Finances and Consumption Survey, available now for all the countries participating in the Eurozone. And crucially, in the context of what we're focused on here, namely intergenerational transmission, these ask pretty similar questions about all the a full retrospection. Any substantial gifts or inheritances you've received in the past should be reported in some detail. And this is the core information we'll be using. And there have been a variety of studies using these sources or using register data for Nordic countries, or in the UK case, using mostly other surveys that, that give you some insights into patterns of transfers, but unlike the WAS, are not specifically designed to capture wealth in all its depth. So the Wealth and Asset Survey covers Great Britain, so that's what we'll be talking about, not Northern Ireland. Started in 2006, is a longitudinal survey, unlike the other surveys I've mentioned. That longitudinal structure has a lot of potential, but also creates a lot of problems. In particular, it creates problems because subsequent waves after the first wave only asked about receipts of transfers since the previous wave. So for full retrospection, you're relying on what was asked in the first wave. This did, at least in the case of inheritances, involve full retrospection, not so for gifts, but unfortunately there were a lot of missing values for inheritance amounts due to an issue with the implementation of the survey. So for this reason, Wealth and Asset Survey has mostly not been used in comparative studies of wealth transmission. We have sought to address the problems with the survey in order to do this, using data from wave 3 of households who continued from wave 1 through to wave 3. And aggregating across the waves to try and get as full a picture of receipts as we could. We can come back in the discussion to the very specific issues, including the ones I've listed here on this overhead, on this slide, that we had to deal with, going beyond the imputation of missing values to a number of non-consistencies with the other sources that we tried to rectify. Again, we can come back to that. And that includes how wealth itself is defined. So coming to the results, the headline that one would start with is how many households are reporting receipt of any transfers. And the answer to that is in the UK case, about 1 in 3 report having had such a receipt. This isn't an surveys. The outlier here is the US, where only about 20% of households are reporting any such receipt. And there's some issues with the data for Spain for gifts that I won't dwell on. We can look at patterns of receipt in various dimensions. We look at not just how frequent it is that a household reports receipt of intergenerational transfers, but how big those transfers are and how the total of transfers reported is distributed across the age distribution, the income distribution, and the wealth distribution. So going through those rather rapidly, we see here that the average amount received, so this is aggregated across however many receipts are reported up to 3 or 4. Average amounts are relatively low in the UK when put in a common currency in the red bars here, but highest not in the US as one might have expected, but in Italy. If we look at how these transfers are distributed across the age distribution, so remember this is somebody who's, let's say currently age 50, reporting how much they've received to date. They may well receive more in the future. And of course, the older they get, the more likely that they are to have received, the more likely, in effect, that their parents are to have passed on their wealth through transferring or through passing away. So here we see that in the UK, there's a rather smooth pattern whereby those at the youngest ages are unlikely to have reported any receipt. And that probability rises pretty steadily with age. But it's interesting that that pattern is not replicated everywhere else. But although it is the case that in most countries, the oldest age group, over 65s, are at least as likely to have received some transfer as other age groups, if not more. But sometimes the intermediate age groups are as likely to have received. How is it spread across the income distribution is of interest. Here again, the UK pattern on the left is pretty smooth. Those in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, only about 10% have received, about 10% of the amounts transferred in total went to people who are currently in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, compared to about 45% going to those who are currently in the top quartile of the income distribution. And in the UK case, about 10% going to the top 1% of the income distribution. Again, you see some variation across the countries, with more concentration at the top in some countries than in others, notably France. But in a sense, what we're more interested rather than current income is how does this vary with current wealth? Because that's going to lead us into the key question of what influence does the receipt of transfers have on your past receipt of transfers have on your current level of wealth. So here you see again a rather smooth pattern for the UK, where only less than 5%, or that's about 3% of total intergenerational wealth transfers go to those in the bottom quartile of the current wealth distribution, compared to about 65% going to those in the fourth quartile, and with about 10 to 12% going to those in the top 1% of the current wealth distribution. And again, some degree of consistency across countries here in this patterning, which we will come back to. So sorry, I should have said at the outset that this draws on an in-depth report that we did, supported by the Nuffield Foundation, which I'll end with the reference, but all the gory details on both our data manipulation and on our findings are presented in some depth in that report, which is available, as I'll say at the end. So we modeled receipt of transfers, both in a two-part model, looking at what distinguishes those who have any receipt, and then among those, what distinguishes those who've received a lot rather than a little. And maybe the thing to focus on here is the role of education, because looking at the bottom of this table, you'll see that having a third level education is associated with a substantially higher probability of having a receipt in most countries, and that in the UK, it's pushing 30%. You're about 30% more likely to have received some transfer if you have third level education than the baseline of lower secondary. And that's that effect, that education patterning is even more pronounced if we look at amounts received among recipients, where those with third level education in the UK context receive about 2/3 more than those with lower secondary given receipt. And you'll see that this number for the UK is not out of line with what we see for other countries, but that in the US, it's that benefit to those with third level education is even more pronounced, pushing it's 183% higher. I'll skip that for reasons of time. So what about the relationship between receiving intergenerational transfers and current wealth levels? So if we simply compare those who have received with those who haven't and look at their average wealth, we see a substantial wealth benefit to those who have received. But of course, they are different from other households, from non-recipient households in many other respects. If we adjust for age, gender, household composition, a number of other things, that reduces the gap, but not by all that much in the UK case. So we still see a gap of about 200,000 sterling in current wealth levels between those who haven't received some intergenerational transfers when we adjust for a bunch of demographics. But we want to look in more detail then at what the impact of receipt versus non-receipt of an intergenerational transfer is on not just current wealth levels, but on the inequality in the distribution of wealth. And this has become a very hot topic in the literature and a very hotly debated topic. Notably because some of the studies based on register data for Nordic countries have suggested that when you track recipients versus non-recipients through these registers, that you see that wealth transfers are actually wealth equalizing, rather than the common presumption, I guess, that they would be disequalizing and contributing to wealth inequality. Now, one of the things we try and bring out in our report and in a couple of journal papers published from it is that reaching that conclusion very much depends on not just the method you employ, but also what you think the counterfactual is. What are you comparing the world that we see, the patterning of wealth transfers that we see, with when we say that wealth transfers are equalizing versus disequalizing? So we have a number of different approaches entered in the report, of which I'll concentrate here on two. One is decomposition of the Gini coefficient, which decomposes quite neatly in this context into different sources of wealth, transfer versus non-transfer, and then another method drawing on influence function regressions. So sorry to have to get through this pretty rapidly. If we look at the Gini decomposition, which studies like, for example, Crawford and Hood, IFS study from 2016 for the UK, with a different data source would have employed, we come to fairly similar conclusions here, that if we count as transfer wealth, the total reported receipt of intergenerational transfers, which we may or may not capitalize to assume that there's been for example, a 3% return since receipt. If we take that to be transfer wealth, subtracted from total wealth, and the difference is non-transfer wealth, then the Gini decomposition suggests that transfer wealth contributes somewhere between 15 and 30% to overall wealth inequality, essentially depending on whether you capitalize receipts or not.
5 minutes left, Brian.
Thank you very much, Joe. If we then turn to the alternative or complementary methodology in employing recentered influence function regressions, this has the advantage that rather than saying, what if there were no transfers, and we're comparing a world with transfers to a world without transfers, this allows us to say, well, what if there were marginally more or marginally fewer transfer recipients? And in particular, what if there were marginally more or marginally fewer large transfer recipients of large transfers? And the results, I'll show you the graphic, but the results are captured in the words on the slide here, that having more small or medium-sized transfers would be associated indeed with less wealth inequality, consistent with those Nordic studies I was mentioning. But crucially, having more recipients of large intergenerational transfers would be associated with greater wealth inequality. And that's captured in this slide here, where there are differences in the scale of the impact from one country to the next, but the general patterning of the impact is really rather similar in terms of that headline finding I just articulated. So this is obviously pretty interesting in the context of current debates about taxation of wealth and of wealth transfers, which are on the agenda, particularly in terms of paying for the costs of the pandemic, but more broadly in terms of trying to produce not just the revenue that would give rise to, but trying to have a tax-driven reduction in wealth inequality and improvement in intergenerational equality of opportunity. So this is in a context where inheritance and gift taxes have become almost irrelevant, even in countries where they haven't actually been abolished. The UK debate is very specific about the intricacies of the current system rather than about the extent to which it actually raises any serious revenue or could have a serious impact on wealth inequality. This is an important part of the context here is Tony Atkinson's and others' advocacy of a shift from the current UK system where to a system where lifetime capital receipts are aggregated and taxed in the hands of the recipient rather than bequests being taxed. And it's interesting that my own country where I'm sitting now, Ireland, did this back in the 1970s. It didn't succeed in raising very much more revenue, but that probably wasn't the goal. One could argue that it's a fairer way of gathering that amount of data, that the amount of revenue that the UK currently raises, while also offering the opportunity to raise more. Issues with the Wealth and Asset Survey. This has serious implications going forward for how this is framed and how it seeks to capture transfers, which we can talk about in the discussion. And these are the couple of, this is where you can go to see all the gory details. So I'll conclude there, Joel, and thank you very much for the attention of the participants.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. That was a really interesting presentation and exactly on time according to my clock. So thanks a lot. So we've got 10 minutes now for questions. I've got a few of my own, but let's see whether any questions will filter in right now in the Q&A. There's none, but we'll give a chance for people to think about questions.
Great.
So I'll start with one of my own. So just at the end there, you I thought it was really interesting. You mentioned the capital acquisition tax, the way of thinking about taxing these gifts and intergenerational transfers. How expansive would that be? Actually, is that I mean, I got two questions here. Would that cover things like tuition payments and those kinds of leg up opportunities that sort of wealthier families provide for their children? How expansive does that actually the reach of that?
I think the usual way of trying to frame these would be that what would be covered would be rather similar to what's covered by current bequest taxes. But obviously one can frame them as broadly or as narrowly as you like. Obviously, one of the big issues in the bequest context has been what do you do with the principal private residence? How are capital gains taken into account, and so on. But really, it's that is entirely a matter of decision. That the same issues arise in the scope of a capital acquisitions tax as they do any form of capital transfer, and I guess the key consideration is not to leave the sort of very significant opportunities for avoidance that simply drive a coach and horses through the revenue raising capacity, particularly with respect to those who can afford expensive advice.
So just a follow-on question here on this sort of this potential policy. I wonder, I mean, it sort of is almost, to me, sounds like you're moving towards a sort of wealth tax actually, but it's the sort of inherited wealth accumulated over several years throughout the life course. I wonder whether actually, at the same time, these intergenerational taxes become less important in terms of inheritance and gift tax. I wonder whether this, together sort of provides impetus for a wealth tax
Sure.
in general as another solution. And I know there's been some thinking around that recently in the UK Wealth Tax Commission. So I wondered just if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. And and I think I should have mentioned the work of the Tax Commission by your colleague Andy Summers in LSE and Arne Advani, which I think has really insightful things to say about this whole topic. So I think there are, to some extent, the arguments for a capital transfer tax and a wealth tax overlap, and to some extent they can be distinguished. And those who are advocating one or the other sometimes would be happy to see both. I guess the distinction that we might want to draw is so wealth tax will obviously apply irrespective of how that wealth was arrived at. Whereas when we're thinking about intergenerational transfers, I think there are additional considerations to do with fairness and opportunity. So I should have said, of course, also taking into account what has always driven tax policy, which is feasibility. and in one sense, the reason why transfers often were taxed in the past rather than stocks is that it's easier to do it. And this would be true going back hundreds of years. So feasibility and is an absolutely central consideration in thinking about taxes. But I suppose if you were to poll the person in the street, they might feel differently about wealth that was generated by just to pick a random example, inventing a vaccine that was going to vaccinate us against COVID, as opposed to from a large transfer from your parents. And so I think both those issues of feasibility and fairness, that taxing transfers is not just about raising revenue; it's about leveling the playing field. And there is some degree of support for that, I think, in public opinion, although it tends to get rather soft when you start talking concrete cases and when you start talking in particular about what always gets called the family home.
Great, thanks for that answer. We've got a couple of questions by Keshab in the Q&A, one of which is just a clarification question. I wonder if we could just unmute Keshab to ask his question.
I really enjoyed this presentation. It is great. I also, in the meantime, downloaded these webs of wealth and asset. I will study this further. If I get a paper from you, I would very much appreciate. And then my question is, one, clarifying, as you said, is this seventh web, web 7, available now for this wealth and asset survey? That is just a clarification question. Another one is there is an increasing perception in the society that inequality has increased in the last decade or last 2 decades. Do this wealth and asset survey show this consistently? So yeah, just my simple questions.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Taking those in reverse order, there has been some increase in wealth inequality as measured in the Wealth and Asset Survey and other sources in the UK, but over the last couple of decades. But what's striking is that that doesn't match the increase in wealth inequality seen in some other countries over the same period, notably in the US. There are some very real data challenges in terms of trying to combine survey and administrative data to get a comprehensive picture of what's happened to the wealth distribution. But if you look, for example, at the aggregate measures for wealth inequality shown on the World Inequality database's very informative site, they suggest that wealth inequality has not risen to the same extent as elsewhere. Let's put it that way, as other rich countries, but partly because of the very important role of home ownership and what's happened to house prices. But so there's a very good article by Tony Atkinson and Salvatore Morelli, one of our co-authors, and Facundo Alvarado on that topic that you might want to, in fiscal studies, that you might want to find. On the data, the fundamental problem that the Wealth and Asset Survey faces is its longitudinal structure and the attrition that you get from wave to wave. So they've had to supplement the sample repeatedly, and in the context of transfers, they haven't asked the new cases, the new households that they have supplemented the sample with. They haven't asked them a fully retrospective question about their transfer receipt. So we have that information for a smaller and smaller proportion of the WS sample as time goes on. ONS are looking at that, and we've been talking to them about that. They're well aware of the issue, and they're trying to come up with solutions in the context of also being highly challenged in COVID.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So we're actually at the just past the half-hour mark, so we'll move on to the next presentation. Thanks very much, Brian. Really fascinating work, and as you said, the report is available online. So thanks very much. So now we've got Victor to present. So please, Victor, could you share your screen and get it going? Thanks. Victor, you're on mute.
That's it. Okay, let me begin again by thanking the organizers for having me on this occasion. Let me begin by saying that we have developed a procedure to sort of take advantage of all available income sources to get a better picture, a clearer picture, we think, about how how income is distributed. This we have named the maximum constraint zero likelihood criterion, which will allow us and got this. Allows to compare to use simultaneously several data sources. We will use the Mexican data to illustrate applications of this criterion to survey data, to income data, and also to national accounts data, so that we can compare between countries, between Mexican states, and also make comparisons a long time. Distributions are obviously, it goes without saying that they are very important inputs for many policy purposes, for many studies, for taxation, as we just had. So, but the main source for the construction of an income distribution are usually survey data. There are also records, administrative records that can be used, for instance, for tax records. But the main source used in many countries is clearly a survey data on income particularly. But they have two problems in particular: underreporting of household income, and also what we've come to call truncation. That is, the top income households are not usually included in a random sample, and even when they are, the response may be missing. So yeah, we have then complementary data sources such as like the national accounts, not usually suited for distributional purposes, and also the tax records, which in Mexico, not everyone is supposed to file a tax return. So they are not complete either. There's another point of concern between surveys and national accounts, for instance, in Mexico. The main source is the National Income and Expenditure Survey, which has a sample size of about 10,000. That was in 2012. But there's a discrepancy in total current income as estimated by the sample and by the national accounts. The disproportionately larger value for national accounts is 2.5 times that of the survey. So, so far, many suggestions have been made to adjust incomes or their aggregates to these SMA figures, assuming the difference is explained totally by either underreporting or truncation. Some previous work that has been done on the subject beginning in 1970 for Latin America and Mexico, discussing current income discrepancies and how to correct them. ECLAC followed the work by Altimir, suggesting that proportional adjustments by income source, assuming representativeness of the sample. Leiva Parra made a survey of all adjustment proposals in the literature by the time of 2004, and suggested there ought to be an optimality criterion in order to make comparisons between different proposals. Campos Vasquez, for instance, more recently, we followed a proposal by Wagner and Milanovic to correct only the upper tail of the distribution while dealing with optimal taxation. Regarding limitations of surveys, for instance, you can look at Kaurinek and for discrepancies between surveys and national accounts, you can see Pessoa and Wagner and Milanovic, which I just mentioned. So let me begin by stating what we want to do. We want to produce likelier estimates for household income distributions which agree with more than 2 data sources. The criterion makes comparisons possible, producing arbitrariness. Initially, we tried proof parametric families, gamma, generalized gamma, and generalized beta of the second kind to reduce arbitrariness, and all available sources were used. How? This is the criterion. So you can see that we have a likelihood weighted by inclusion probabilities, the inverse of inclusion probabilities, plus a set of constraints that have to be satisfied by the parameters, the estimated parameters. So we get from a model the likelihood and also the shape of these functions of the parameters. And then from the data, we get from the survey the income values, the declared income values, as well as the weights, and also the constants these functions ought to be equal to in the end. So an example of these constraints, for instance, would be something like this. We have an average household income for from SNA, for instance, and then we try and force the parameters to satisfy this constraint so that the average income from the fitted model is equal to the one from SNA. We also have what we call an integral, an income integral, which more or less states that the average income of households earning more than a threshold 5 sub-A ought to be equal to the same average obtained from tax records. Typically, alpha would be something like 10 to the minus 5 or 10 to the minus 6 a million for 100,000, more or less. Constraints are important. When we fitted two models, as I mentioned, generalized gamma and type 2 beta, they have 3 or more parameters. 2 constraints are being applied, so we must have more parameters than constraints, otherwise the survey data doesn't give it. And we used we used 2 thresholds. I'm sorry, 2 thresholds and the same value for estimated household average income. So this is the result. We have in a blue dotted line the empirical accumulated distribution of income And in green and red, although they are mostly superimposed, and you can see the green one clearly, we get the 2 fits by the, in the case of the generalized gamma, and the 2 fits in the phi 2 generalized beta. For the case of our sample, we have, for instance, a Gini coefficient of 0.45 and the ratio of total income in the 10th decile to the total income in the first decile of 21.6 times that income. If we go to the fits, we can see, for instance, that the optimal value of our criterion is fairly similar in all 4 cases. So there's little or no difference between models or thresholds. And that can also be seen in the amount, the size of the Gini coefficients, which have gone from 0.45, as I mentioned, to something between 0.61 and 0.64. And the ratio of the 10th decile to the first goes from 21.6 to 51 times to 54 times when these criterions apply to the 2012 data. We can see these things in a different manner. For instance, we have the 5 bottom income groups according to the models, which keep 11.7% of total income, whereas the top 10% get 53.8%. And this one has been also further divided. So we get that the 1% at the top keeps 22.36% of income. Something similar happens with the second one. That is, the models are nearly irrelevant in this case, and so are the thresholds. So constraints weigh heavily on estimates. Too many constraints will render data useless. Changes in data have little or no effect on future models. Evidence of both underreporting and truncation can be found in the sample, and an optimal fit shows underreporting grows more than proportional with income. Okay, so we have the Mexican Household Income Expenditure Survey, which takes place every year. Its SNA summaries also published every year, and we got anonymized tax records from 2010, 2012, 2015, and 2016. So we were able to apply our method with a few adjustments, which I will mention. According to ENIC, the inequality in Mexico had not increased. Gini coefficient was updated around 0.45 for the country in the period. Ratio of 10 to the first decile shows a downward trend. When all 3 sources are taken into consideration for MCPL, then we get in that in 2016, the Gini coefficient was about 0.65 for the first time, and the ratio 10 to the first decile rose from 55 times to 75 times in 2016. This is more or less what these graphs tell us. At the bottom, we have the ENIC survey alone, and at the top, we get the results of using all 3 sources through the model, and then we can see that, as I mentioned, for the first time, 0.65 was. What happens for the 10th to the first decile income? We had something rather similar for the first 2 years, and then these began to increase, as opposed to what the survey tells us what happens throughout the country for those years. So with a special social conditions module from ENIC, we could, with a larger sample size, fit models for each state and each year for the period, and so carry out comparisons between those states at a long time. As no institutional sector accounts are produced at state level in Mexico, the SNA national household income was proportionately distributed according to NCS module. shares. Tax records include taxpayers of state of residence, so individual state income thresholds were developed by year from them. In all, we adjusted 128 models. We have not programmed any multi-level models, so things like that. So what we're about to see is that in contrast with countrywide behavior, 2016 does not appear to be the most unequal year within each state. Within state inequality may have in fact decreased. This is what we find from the results. And we pose a question: is this evidence that between states inequality grew? We have yet to develop a procedure to prove this, but that's what has happened. For instance, we can see from the Gini's for all 32 states in Mexico that there are certain clear patterns of states more unequal than others, with some uncertainty in the middle, but still we can see the geometric mean of the biennial growth of Gini coefficients between states is quite unequal. It goes from +3% to -2%. So states have grown more or less unequal over time. So comparisons between countries from survey results usually ignore differences in sampling design, oversampling of high-income households, for instance, or of the analysis calibrations of sampling data to known totals. The standard analysis procedures are useful, though, but for more general purposes, our approach allows for fairer comparisons, since SNA constraints stem from sound and comparable methodology. Constraints reduce sampling design or data analysis influence and makes model choice less arbitrary. So, as we suggested, introduce the maximum constraints in the likelihood criterion to fit income parametric distributions using simultaneously several data sources. We discussed the evolution of income distributions in Mexico. We've made some comparisons based mainly on inequality measurements. And from these comparisons, we find that national inequality has increased in the period, which contrasts with inequity results. Within state inequality does not seem to have grown in general, and seems to suggest that between states inequality has grown. There are some references, and I hope I saved some time.
Thanks very much, Victor. Yes, there's definitely time for questions. We have just over 10 minutes for questions. So thanks very much for that presentation. Very interesting. I've got a few of my questions ready. Let's see if there's any in the Q&A box. Not any yet. So let's give some time for people to think about questions, and I'll ask a couple if I may. So yeah, really interesting. I just wonder, it was quite a stark, substantial difference between the survey Gini coefficient and the one that results from your approach to combining these different data sets. So I wonder if you could just actually elaborate on why there is, what is driving that substantial difference. I think it was from 0.45 Gini coefficient to 0.65.
In fact, in the first applications of our method, we had only two sources, the SNA and the survey. In that case, the difference between the Ginis was even larger. We got a Gini about 80% when using only those two sources. In fact, the tax data came to correct what we were looking at. And what we're seeing is at last introducing the upper tail of distribution, which is not seen by surveys in many cases. The surveys miss that part of the population. It's a very tiny group of households which get a very large proportion of income, and randomly chosen. They are usually not introduced in the sample. So the sample, in fact, is not totally representative of the population of households in a country or in a state. That's mainly the problem. And when we introduce tax data, we are allowed them to see what's going on, and at that level of income.
Right, it's quite astonishing the difference that you find when you do so. So really interesting. I wondered also if you could talk through about these the trends that you document for the national as compared to the state level. I wondered whether so you have this sort of these different stories. So on the national level, increase, whereas within state decrease. So I wonder maybe if you could speak to what might be driving these different trends in terms of economic policy in recent years. What kind of explanation is there?
There have been studies in Mexico regarding different patterns of growth and of marginality and poverty and so on. And in fact, what we have seen in those cases is that there is a discrepancy, there's a divergence of paths between states and between municipalities as well. So this may be another expression of precisely that diversion of paths from, even though within state inequality remains reasonably small, between state inequality seems to be growing in Mexico. That seems to be driving. But we have no further evidence to support.
Great, thanks for that answer. I just have one more question here that I noted down. Yeah, I wondered if you could speak to the sort of generalizability of your methods outside of Mexico, and what are potentially challenges for implementing the methods in other countries, and have you tried to do so already? But just to speak to that kind of generalizability.
Okay. Yes. Many countries have income surveys, so that should not represent a problem. Not every country has the opportunity to make available tax records, for instance. Not everyone gets that. However, we found that if we could get thresholds or the size of the population which gets income beyond those thresholds, only from the tax authority, we could simplify access to that information. That's all we need in reality. We don't need individual tax filings, tax records, but we need a threshold and a population size. That's it. And as for the SNA records, as you saw, we have totals for the country, but we do not have totals for each state. It would be simpler for comparisons between countries to get those statistics, because most of them develop as a system of national accounts. So they would be able to provide that information.
Okay, thanks. Any questions out?
Brian Nolan's hand is up.
Oh, sorry, I haven't seen that yet. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and very interesting talk. I was wondering what you could say in terms of the intuition for how your approaches relate to the ones adopted, for example, in the World Inequality Database, where they're now combining top income shares derived from tax and social tax and national accounts data with survey data to come up with corrected inequality measures for a variety of income concepts, using a mixture of replacement and reweighting approaches. And I was wondering how you see your approach fitting, or what's the intuition for how it relates to those sort of replacement and reweighting approaches.
What I've seen from this effort from the school in Paris is that they have made a great effort in gathering data. I have seen very little, however, in terms of the analysis, the models, the reweighting of that data. So I couldn't really say much about it. What we see in this case is that the model is helping us indeed to reweight and introduce information from our sources and gathering together through a model. I'd be very interested to get some idea of what they are doing. If you have any
I'm particularly interested with colleagues. I'm trying to write a paper teasing out exactly what they do. So I'd be delighted to share it with you and get your advice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I'll start sharing my screen now.
Okay.
And we'll go with my presentation, the final presentation of this session. Hold on one moment. Great. So I adjust the prices within each window to the end of that window. Now, so together, this data, quite, a huge number of observations. We can therefore go very low to measure the distribution of housing values, so housing value inequality, and reliably doing so at the lower super output area. So that's, there's 42,000, over 42,000 ESCoEs in the UK. They have an average population of around 1,400 individuals. And given the size of the data and the sort of coverage of the data, I've got an average of over 500 housing values per ESCoE. So I mean that's like pretty much the entire covering the entire population there. So let's now talk about how good this data is for first housing values. So how does Zoopla compare with land registry, and then I'll talk about how whether using housing value inequality as a measure of inequalities is worthwhile. So I'll get to that next. So first, how good are the price estimates that Zoopla provides? So as you can see from this figure, there's the diagonal line and plotting the natural log of the Zoopla price estimate against the realized price for the address in question. So basically, I've got the Zoopla price estimates for September 2019. And I matched that with realized transactions for the subsequent 2 months, October, November. And I have from that, so 37,000 addresses that I have a Zoopla price estimate for were then sold. And I have the realized price for that. So that's what I'm plotting here. So pretty symmetrical, it looks pretty good. There's a correlation coefficient of 0.94. And the mean percentage error is only 1.64%. So that's the that's saying that Zoopla is slightly optimistic, but very, very slightly optimistic in terms of the price estimate. Now, okay, so more generally, is housing value inequality a good way of thinking about economic inequality? I mean, there's some clear drawbacks here. This housing values don't necessarily align with income or wealth of the inhabitants of that house. And we, with this data, we don't observe who owns the house. We don't know if the house is rented by the occupiers or owned by somebody and living somewhere else as a second home, whether the house is empty. So we don't have any of that information. There's a number of reasons why I think this is a worthwhile way of thinking about economic inequality. The first is that housing constitutes the majority, just about 60% of total wealth in the UK. So that's taken from the Wealth and Asset Survey. So really, we're getting at, a clear, this is a sort of a measure of wealth inequality at its core. Secondly, and given an absence of income or wealth data, using housing is actually something that's not really that novel. And this is something that is done quite a bit by economic historians. So for instance, using archaeological data on housing size distributions, or information on property tax and rents, historical records of those. And those, so housing forms a kind of basis for which economic historians can estimate historical or even ancient inequality levels. So going back to, some studies go back to the Iron Age in the UK and measure inequality using archaeological data. And lastly, and this is a point echoing the introduction, what really matters for thinking about the consequences of inequality for behavior and attitudes is perceptions of inequality. And really, so in that sense, it doesn't really matter how aligned housing value inequality is with objective measures of inequality, but whether it's perceived, like whether the housing value inequality is something that's relevant for perceptions of inequality. And so there's quite a bit of research now which suggests that perceptions are very important, crucial, more so than objective measures of inequality. And so really what matters here is whether housing value inequality is perceptually relevant. So that's what I'll turn to right now, to assessing. So I really want to understand whether housing value inequality is salient. So I've got two different surveys with which I can sort of answer that question. The first is the British election study from 2015. So it's got just over 12,000 observation. It goes only as far down in terms of geographical markers to the EM2021 level. So that's one level above the ESCoE, which I introduced earlier. So it's got an average of about 7,000 inhabitants. And they asked this question about, they asked a number of questions about local communities, and one of them is about estimating the level of income inequality in one's local community. I then gathered my own data to sort of improve on the data available from the British election study. So I got a representative sample, which the British election study is not. I got information on postcodes, and I included additional controls with which the British election study did not, which controls which are known to be important for perceptions of inequality. So in particular, social dominance orientation, and personal relative deprivation. So I was able to ask these questions as well. So now let's look at the results from those two surveys. So a simple random intercept model with all these additional controls. So as much as is warranted to sort of try to explain away perceptions of local inequality. And so including all these controls, there's a strong relationship still. These are standardized coefficients. So one standard deviation increase in local inequality, local housing value inequality, results in around 8 to 10% standard deviation increase in perceptions of local inequality. So that's a British election study. Now moving on to the representative survey. So here I'm able to go below the EM2021. So that was at the EM2021 level. Now looking at both the ESCoE and EM2021 level, including the same controls and also adding on those extra additional important controls. So personal relative deprivation scale, PRDS, and social dominance orientation. In all cases, again, see a similarly sized coefficient. So going from about 7.7% to over 9%. And in terms of the substantiveness, so it's kind of surprising at first to glance that the sort of objective reality in terms of housing value inequality around you only accounts for 8%, around 8% of a standard deviation. But this actually compares favorably, relatively well with the crucial variable personal relative deprivation, which, as you see here, the standardized coefficient is around 15%. So it is actually, in relative terms, substantive. Okay, and lastly, so I really want to drill down and understand what it is about local areas which people, what kind of information people are using to form their perceptions of inequality. So I not only asked this kind of numerical question, but I also gave them a free text box. And I just said, and this is surprisingly something that is not really done in the literature on perceptions, is just asking people, why do you, rate the inequality the way you do? And so I provided that opportunity. And so what do people mention? So here is the top, I think it's 20 terms, stems of words. So people is the first, and then coming in second is housing, or the stem for housing. There's, looking down the list, there's a few more which suggest housing. So properties, there's also home, estate, council. So, suggesting different features of the housing stock. And there's also, of course, income, and, the top one being people. So, the people you encounter. So, this sort of reinforces the conclusion that housing value inequality is perceptually relevant. Lastly, just to kind of hammer that point across, how much are people keying in on things like housing versus income? And actually, it turns out that income is less important for people's, the formation of people's perceptions than housing. And that makes sense. I mean, we don't normally know what our neighbors make in terms of income. We don't ask them. It's not really polite to ask that question. But rather, we form judgments. We believe our neighbors have a certain level of income or wealth based on things that we can observe about them. Housing being, obviously the one that I suggest in here is important, but also things like, the car they drive, the clothes they wear, anything about their consumption habits that we can see. So really, it's this visual element, and we see that being borne out here by an analysis of different terms. So I've constructed a dictionary. So I've sort of brought together different words which suggest either this housing, any word that sort of relates to housing, estate, council, house, housing, home, property, rent, and words related to income. So what, things like that might suggest people are thinking about income when they form their perceptions. And then just, doing a sort of very simple count of those words in the text box. And housing comes out tops. And then, so you might also think, well, we don't really know much about the nuance in what people are saying. Is it that they know about income, or what basically, can we put the words in context and try to understand what people are saying? And so just a few examples to do that. So people saying that, there's a huge mix of council estates and multi-million-pound houses. I mean, that's why they think there's a level of income that they do. Poor people with government housing in areas with with fancy big houses. So again, sort of keying in on these housing discrepancies. And here's, suggesting that, the income is just sort of inferred rather than actually observed. So people have higher incomes, which is saying is obvious because I can see their cars and things like that, the cars they drive. And then, lastly, someone saying, I don't really know about other people's income and wealth, so I can only really base it on the state of properties. So obviously that's the sort of the quote which really sort of underlines my point here. It's forming judgments, forming perceptions about inequality is really derived from what you can see, and housing is a key feature of what you can see. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you housing value inequality is a good measure of inequality, particularly in the absence of income or wealth data. Now, let me spend some time, the last 5 minutes I have, to describe patterns of local inequality in the UK. So here's neighborhood level inequality. So both the UK and London pulled out. And I think the first thing to note is the range of, is the Gini coefficient is being measured, the range of the Gini coefficient. So it goes from less than 0.2 to over 0.6. And that's really a massive range, and suggests massive difference in the lived experiences of people in London. And so really this very high degree of inequality, neighborhood level inequality is you know, in central London and the south west of London. And places to the east and west are actually highly equal. So there's a huge discrepancy in lived experience. And looking at the sort of UK map as a whole, you can see that sort of around cities in particular, you have this kind of extreme inequality and extreme equality side by side. And really, you know, my point throughout this is, you know, that's something we need to sort of understand if we're going to understand the consequences of inequality for attitudes and behavior. We need to understand the differences in those lived experiences. You can also aggregate this up and also provide a city level view. And this is actually also something that you know, the extent of this descriptive information is actually something completely new for the UK. I'm basically adding on to going deeper than what other studies have done before because of this data limitation problem. And so I'm able to rank all 77 cities, areas which have over 100,000 people living in them. So we can go and look at the top 10 versus the bottom 10. And I think just the main thing to say here is that actually inequality is not really all about, I mean, you see inequality in cities which are rich and poor. So you have Greater London is unsurprisingly the most unequal city based on the Gini and the top 1% concentration. But you also have Glasgow coming in as third, and Glasgow is not usually considered you know, it has a large poorer population. So there's quite a lot of nuance in terms of inequality at the subnational level. On the flip side, the most equal cities here. So the most equal is actually a satellite town of London at 0.2 Gini coefficient versus London at 0.35. You know, not far away, but you know, vastly different Gini coefficients. And actually, this range from 0.35 to 0.2 is larger than a range between countries like the UK and countries which we consider to be equal, like Norway. So that's, you know, it's a pretty substantial range between these different cities. I realize I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly mention a bit of the descriptive data on changes in inequality. So looking at the land registry now. Now what I have here is in red reductions in the difference in the Gini in 2019 and 1999. So just the percentage point difference. And actually it turns out that most areas have seen a decline in housing value inequality. Most neighborhoods, LSOAs, have seen a decline. There's quite a bit of variation in the standard deviation, but the mean is negative 0.18. And so what this suggests, and this is sort of an area for future work, is that there's a greater degree of economic segregation. So an increase in economic segregation over time. We could also look at the city level again, and you also have this negative average, so a decline in city level inequality over time. And again, there's a sort of these are the top 10. So this is increase in inequality, and you know, sort of Oxford and Cambridge, you sort of would expect to see there, given their their improvements in sort of their economic prosperity. But you also have the reverse. You have a city like Blackpool, which is you know, quite a different kind of story, but still has seen a large increase in this measure of inequality. And you could drill down and try to sort of explain why that is. And a lot of it seems to be at the bottom end of looking at the fifth decile to the first decile ratio. And you see that has changed quite a bit. So I'll just leave it there. So in conclusion, you know, this is a novel way of measuring inequality fills an important gap around measuring inequality at the local level using lots of data on housing values. I've shown that housing value inequality is perceptually relevant. It's associated robustly and substantively with people's perceptions of local inequality. And I've shown a couple of facts around inequality in the UK, how large of a range there is within UK cities and across the UK, and also how that's changed over time. So I think this data I am post publication going to release it publicly, and on request I'm very happy to share the data ahead of that, and I think that hopefully that could be useful to people trying to understand the consequences of inequality. So all sorts of important behaviors and attitudes. Hopefully this can help shed light on those. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me see where are the Q&A? Oh, I see some questions in the Q&A. So actually, I wonder maybe we could unmute the different individuals. So maybe starting with Mark Gronwald, if you want to just ask your question, might be easier than me reading it.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So yeah, my question is, so you talk about perceived inequality, okay, I guess, well, I'm also very concerned about that in a way, but then I'm just wondering, to what extent is this perception driven by exposure? So say, when you live in London, maybe you are just simply staying in some area all the time, more or less. You work there, you live there, you go to school there, you don't really move away. And also, just simply you don't even visit other areas. So this means you are simply much less exposed maybe to either richer or poorer areas. Whereas in smaller towns, so it's different. So you go to the city center, and then of course, maybe you pass through a richer or poorer areas, and then you actually see how other people live. So to what extent do you think does this affect this perceived inequality, simply whether or not you're living in a smaller or larger town and you're actually exposed, physically exposed to that? Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's a really good question, a really good point. So I think obviously you learn about inequality and your perceptions of inequality, either at the local or national level, that's important, but obviously how that's formed is not solely based on what you can see around you in your neighborhood. I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of other important sources of information. So exposure through commutes, as you suggest, going to different parts of town, or working in a different part of town, different neighborhood, or traveling for whatever reason exposes you to different levels of inequality, and that's obviously another important route for forming perceptions and attitudes and behavior. And likewise, media, the media that you consume will obviously be another important influence. So I guess my response would be that the sort of neighborhood level of inequality is not the only thing that matters, but it is important. It is important for forming friendships, for someone's social network, and the types of people that you encounter in the neighborhood sort of affects those social networks. And as I said, also as a source of information, not the only source, but it is a source of information about the extent of inequality in society and the fairness of that potentially. And there's a number of reasons why the neighborhood context matters. So those are just a few. But yeah, as I said, it's not the only important thing. We next have a question from Pim. Do you want to just ask it?
Yes, sure. I think you already indirectly answered the question during your talk. As an economist, they would typically define housing wealth as the value of a property, which is what you've scraped from the website, against the outstanding mortgage against that property. So you might live in a very expensive house, but if you had to borrow a lot of money to live in that house, you might not actually be wealthy, or an economist would not say that your wealth is particularly high, your net wealth. But I think you answered indirectly that you can only get a sufficiently high mortgage for an expensive house if your income is sufficiently high. So I think indeed, as you said, it must be very important for perceptions that, well, if you live in an expensive house, that must mean your income is sufficiently high so that you can actually get a mortgage to live in that expensive house. So I think this must be a very important channel for how you can say that just the value of the house and not the housing wealth or net wealth of a person living in that house feeds into perceptions of inequality.
Hi, my internet just cut there, but I'm back. Sorry about that. So I'll just carry on going through these questions. So thanks, Andrew, for your reference there. Next is from Michael. So okay, thanks, Michael. So your question is about the policy implications of this work. I think that's a really important question. And actually, I have a number of studies which kind of speak to the implications of the different experiences of inequality. So I'll just maybe, if it makes sense, I'll just, since we're near the time, I'll just get in touch with you, and actually I'll just share those different papers. But they're around voting patterns and pro-social behavior in particular. So I'll get in touch about that if that's best. And lastly, Keshab has a question. Keshab, maybe you want to ask it directly?
Hi, yes, this is really very interesting. You have tackled a very big issue, very important issue. And also presentation was so nice. I really enjoyed it. On inequality issues, when we observe the location or the settlements, there is a quite significant amount of clustering. So people with a similar income group living in this in certain area. So that creates like the inequality within group and between group inequality. Maybe that sort of thing. So exist. So there may be within group inequality may be quite high. Between group inequality may be kind of, as you showed also in that map on London. The central London and the southwest London, quite the inequality, high inequality compared to others. So, do you have plans to indicate this all? So, in some extent, you have done by looking at the Gini coefficient across the region. So, you have also all the perception variables, So how do you compare the perception differences in a different location? Because people of certain the location characteristic may be there. Even if you say you are asking for in a certain question, the people may have a different answer, or the meaning of that may be different, right? Do you realize? Do you agree with this one, this view, this type of view?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. I think it was surprising to me looking at those perceptions, those regression of what matters for perceptions, and I probably should have included the full list of coefficients, standardized coefficients, to see the kind of relative importance. But it's the sort of objective things that you would think matter a lot don't matter as much as I expected, and there's a lot of unexplained variation in perception. So
let me be more specific on this, on the aspiration level. You may compare two individuals. One may be happy when they have some gain of say 5,000. Another may not be happy. In another group, these 5,000 may not be happy until they get to 50,000, something like that. Because of the big gap in income, so we can expect like this, and that can be similar in all other questions as well. The way they see what is the standard of living, what is kind of, so it is quite a difficult issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think you're.
But
you're right.
It's a very nice study. You have tackled a very big issue.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
So
really
do you have also planning to do this translate into the voting patterns and other things like that?
Yeah, so I have a paper. I realize actually we're out of time, but I'll just finish with this. I have a paper which looks at the impact of this local context on Brexit, on the Brexit vote. So another paper on Brexit. There's quite a lot out there, but yeah. So I'm happy to share that with you.
Thanks. Thank you.
So okay, thanks everybody. I thought it was a really great session. Really nice to hear the presentations earlier, and thanks for all the questions. So please, further discussion can be had at the breakout rooms right now, and feel free to get in touch with myself or any of the speakers. So thanks a lot.